NATO may be gradually withdrawing from Afghanistan, but the alliance is making sure its troops are kept busy elsewhere. Officials say military exercises on an unprecedented scale will take place in Europe over the coming years. Now, the latest war games held on Russia's borders in Poland and the Baltic republics that involved 6,000 troops. But that figure will be dwarfed by upcoming drills in Spain and Portugal with a force of more than 40,000 soldiers expected to gather in 2015. Now, the US-led bloc says this will be the first in a series of such exercises designed to make sure the allies keep working closely together. And as RT's Peter Oliver reports, there's little appetite in Europe for this costly deployment.
European nations can and should do more to match America's commitment.
That commitment is set to see upwards of 40,000 troops deployed on manoeuvres within the EU in the coming years, all important work for the future of the alliance.
Once the combat mission in Afghanistan is over, the question is how can you retain these operational experiences and capabilities? And so you must exercise, you must train your forces, you must test whether the old routines work, the command structure works, that the troops are interoperable.
Karl Rehrbaum is a former East German security officer turned author. After spending a career watching NATO during the Cold War, he isn't buying the reason given that this is all part of the winding down of operations in Afghanistan.
There isn't any need to put these troops in Europe. I think they would have ramped up operations even if Afghanistan wasn't coming to an end.
That's down to what he sees as a change in NATO policy following actions in Libya and towards Syria.
Instead of a defensive army, they want to make an army of intervention, of aggression. NATO is responsible for 3/4 of global arms spending at a time when many of its members are flat broke.
Here in central Berlin, a group of demonstrators unfurl a banner saying no to wars of intervention. But with many European economies still far from recovery, there's a lack of enthusiasm for spending more on the military.
It's crazy to think that this has anything to do with any rogue state. By holding operations in Europe, it shows NATO still looks towards Russia.
The population is getting poorer and wars are getting more expensive. This type of exercises are a threat to society.
They want politicians to pay attention to the real cost of military spending. Peter Oliver, RT, Berlin.
And the mountain of debt and austerity in European countries means they've been steadily slashing their defence spending. The aftermath of the wars in Afghanistan and Libya have also decreased the appetite for that of military deployments. But as RT's Gaine Chichikan reports, the US-led bloc may still be prepared to pay the cost of putting more boots on the ground in Europe.
U.S. troops are supposed to be out of Afghanistan by the end of next year. That's around 60,000 troops. The military leadership is already thinking about how to keep them busy. NATO, with its heart and mind in Washington, of course, plans to sharply increase the size of its exercises in Europe in coming years. We're lucky to have Douglas McGregor, retired U.S. Army colonel, with us today. Thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
So the plan for Europe for 2015, NATO has is war games with 40,000 troops in Portugal and Spain. These countries, of course, will have to chip in to make it happen. That's a huge expense for their battered economies. What's the urgency?
Well, whenever NATO conducts exercises of any kind, there's always a great deal of time and money invested in what I would call allied solidarity. And I know there's great concern about the troubled nature of the economies, particularly on the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal and Spain. I think we want to reaffirm that they are close members of the alliance, that we are behind them, that we support them. And what better way to do that than to conduct an exercise on their ground?
Spend a lot of money.
Well, I mean, some of this money is already budgeted. More than half the troops will probably be air and naval forces. So they have to conduct a certain number of operations one way or the other.
There's so many discussions on how NATO sees its future. They're so proud of what they did in Libya. It seems that they see their future in this kind of hit-and-run operations. But what do you think about it?
Libya was not a success. We ultimately unleashed forces in that country, Sunni Islamist forces that are anti-Western, anti-American, and ultimately antithetical to the interests of Libya's future social and political development. We don't know how Libya will turn out.
But NATO sees it as a success.
Well, that's
as an example for future operations.
That is the public message. In truth, there were enormous problems with the operation.
How do you see the future of NATO?
I think it's very questionable. Over time, it's going to be harder and harder to hold the alliance together. And so I don't see the NATO alliance holding together in its current form for another decade.
Well, maybe these exercises are not such a bad idea. Maybe at least for a while, NATO will not actually bomb and invade other countries to keep itself busy. With me in Washington, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and I'm Ganesh Tekyan. You're watching RT.